Dad perfect events. In the park, I found my son sitting on a bench with my grandson and their luggage. I asked him, "Why aren't you at work?" He looked up at me with eyes red from crying and said, "I got fired, Dad. My father-in-law kicked us out. He said our bloodline wasn't worthy of his legacy." I looked at the 3 broken suitcases containing their entire lives, and then I looked at my terrified grandson hugging a dirty teddy bear. I smiled and said, "Get in the truck." It was time Lawrence Gibson found out that the bloodline he just insulted owns the bank that holds his mortgage. I'm Victor Rodriguez, and at 58 years old, I've spent the last 15 years living in a cabin in the woods, driving a rusted Ford F-150 and wearing flannel shirts that have seen better days. To the world, I'm just a retired manufacturing worker, fishing my days away. My son Nathan believes I survive on a small pension, and the occasional fish I catch. He doesn't know that the lake I fish in belongs to me. He doesn't know that the forest surrounding it belongs to me. And he certainly doesn't know that Rodriguez Holdings, the investment firm that just bought his father-in-law's debt, is my company. I raised Nathan to be independent, to value hard work over inheritance. But today, that lesson was going to change. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the water on the lake was glass. I was unhooking a small base, ready to throw it back when the silence was shattered. My phone buzzed against the tackle box. It was a burner phone I kept for emergencies, but the number flashing on the screen was Nathan. It was a local area code. I wiped the fish slime off my hand and answered. "Hello, Dad." The voice was cracked, broken. It sounded like a child who had just scraped his knee, not a 32-year-old lead software engineer. "Nathan." I sat up straighter on my folding chair. "Is everything okay?" There was a long pause filled with the sound of wind hitting a microphone and distant traffic. Then came the sound that no father ever wants to hear, the sound of his grown son trying to suppress a sob. "Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't know who else to call. Do you have space just for tonight? For Bradley and me?" My heart hammered against my ribs. Nathan was the pride of my life. He made 6 figures. He lived in a gated community in a house I could have bought 100 times over, but let him buy himself so he could feel the pride of ownership. He had a wife, Michelle, who liked expensive wine and disliked my cabin. Why was he asking for space? "Where are you, Nathan?" My voice dropped an octave. The fish flopped back into the water, forgotten. "Centennial Park near the North Gate. Please, Dad, just for tonight." I didn't ask another question. I threw the tackle box into the bed of the truck and gunned the engine. My 1998 Ford roared to life, coughing a cloud of black smoke before tearing down the dirt road. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard, my knuckles turned white. Nathan was a good man, too good. He had my work ethic, but he had his mother's soft heart. He married into the Gibson family 5 years ago, and I knew from the wedding day that they looked at him not as a partner, but as an accessory. Lawrence Gibson, the patriarch of that family, was a man who wore suits that cost more than my truck, but had eyes that looked cheap. The drive to the park took 20 minutes. I made it in 10. I pulled up to the curb, and the sight that greeted me made my blood run cold. It wasn't just that they were sitting on a park bench. It was the way they were sitting. Nathan was hunched over, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. My grandson Bradley was 7 years old. He was sitting next to his father, clutching a bear that had missing fur on one ear. But what tore me apart were the suitcases. There were 3 of them. Expensive hard-shell luggage, the kind that's supposed to be indestructible, but the zippers were busted. Clothes were spilling out of the side of one like guts from a wound. A sleeve of one of Nathan's dress shirts was dragging in the dirt. These bags hadn't been packed. They had been thrown. I killed the engine and stepped out. The slam of my truck door made Nathan flinch. He looked up, and the shame in his eyes was almost physical. He stood up, wiping his face, trying to compose himself, trying to be the man he thought I wanted him to be. "Dad," he choked out, "thanks for coming. I know it's a hassle." I walked right past him and knelt down in front of Bradley. "Hey there, little man," I tried to keep my voice steady. "You ready for an adventure at Grandpa's cabin? We can roast marshmallows." Bradley nodded, his eyes wide and fearful. "Grandpa, are we poor now?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I looked up at Nathan. He looked away, unable to meet my gaze. I stood up slowly. The bones in my knees popped, but I felt strong, dangerous. "Nathan, look at me." He finally turned his head. "What happened?" I asked. "And don't give me the sanitized version. I want the truth." Nathan took a shuddering breath. "I went to work this morning. Lawrence called me into his office at 9. I thought we were going to discuss the new software rollout. I built that system, Dad. I spent 3 years coding it. It saved the company millions." I nodded. I knew his talent. He didn't even look up from his desk. He just slid a paper across the mahogany. "Termination notice effective immediately." He said they were downsizing. Downsizing? I repeated the word. It tasted like bile. "You're the lead engineer. You don't downsize the engine of the car while you're driving it." That's what I said. Nathan ran a hand through his hair. I asked him why. I asked him about my severance, about my stock options. He just laughed. He pressed a button and security came in. 2 guys I've known for 5 years. They escorted me out like a criminal. They didn't even let me pack my personal items. They just walked me to the curb. My jaw tightened. This wasn't a business decision. This was a hit. "And Michelle?" I asked. "Where was your wife while her father was firing you?" Nathan looked down at the broken suitcase. "When I got home, my key didn't work. The locks were already changed, Dad. It had only been an hour. They had a locksmith there before I even left the building. I banged on the door. I could hear them inside." He paused and a fresh tear tracked down his cheek. Michelle opened the door. She didn't let me in. She just stood there blocking the way. She said she couldn't be with a failure. She said she needed security, and I couldn't provide it anymore. She chose her daddy's money over her husband, I said as a statement of fact, not a question. Then Lawrence came to the door. Nathan's voice trembled with a mix of rage and humiliation. He kicked these suitcases down the steps. He told Bradley to go with his father because he didn't want him anymore. I felt a cold calm settle over me. It's a feeling I haven't had since my days in the boardroom during a hostile takeover. It's the feeling of knowing your enemy has made a fatal mistake. What exactly did he say, Nathan? I need to know the exact words. Nathan looked me in the eye, and for a second I saw a spark of the anger he should have been feeling. He said, "Your bloodline is weak, Nathan. It's a servant's bloodline. The Gibson family needs noble blood to survive. We've found someone better for Michelle, someone worthy." Worthy. I looked at my son, a man who had never asked me for a dime, who worked 18-hour days to support a wife who spent money faster than he could earn it. I looked at my grandson, a boy who was treated like disposable trash because his last name wasn't Gibson. Lawrence Gibson thought he was royalty because he owned a regional real estate company inherited from his father. He didn't know that true power doesn't scream, it whispers. He didn't know that the man standing in front of him in a stained fishing vest could buy his entire existence with a signature. I reached out and grabbed one of the broken suitcases. The handle was snapped, but I lifted it anyway. "Get in the truck," I said. Nathan hesitated. "Dad, we can't impose. I'll find a motel. I just need to check my accounts. I think they froze the joint account, but I might have some cash." I grabbed him by the shoulder. My grip was iron. "You're not going to a motel. You're coming home. And as for your bloodline," I walked over to the truck and threw the suitcase in the back. It landed with a heavy thud next to my tackle box. I turned back to my son, and for the first time that day I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a wolf who just found the door to the sheep pen unlocked. We're going to show Lawrence Gibson exactly what this bloodline is capable of. The iron gates of the Gibson estate loomed ahead like the entrance to a fortress built on ego and debt. Nathan sat in the passenger seat of my 1998 Ford F-150, clutching the door handle, his knuckles white. I could see the security guard stepping out of his booth, waving his hand for us to stop. I didn't slow down. I rolled down the window and the boy yelled that this was private property and Mr. Gibson wasn't accepting visitors. I looked at him and said, "Tell Lawrence that his past is here to collect." The guard reached for his radio, but I had already shifted into low gear. I didn't ram the gate with speed that would be reckless. Instead, I nudged the heavy steel frame with the reinforced bumper of my truck. The metal groaned in protest. The lock snapped with a sound like a gunshot, and the gate swung open. Nathan gasped, but said nothing. We rolled up the long, winding driveway lined with manicured hedges that cost more than most people earn in a year. I parked my rusted, leaking truck right in the middle of the circular driveway, directly behind a silver Bentley. The front door opened before I even killed the engine. Lawrence Gibson marched out, and he wasn't alone. He held a crystal wine glass in one hand and a half-smoked cigar in the other. Behind him stood a group of people holding cocktail plates. I recognized a few faces, a local councilman, a real estate developer. They were the kind of people who smiled with their teeth, but never with their eyes. Lawrence stopped at the top of the stairs, looking down at us like we were stray dogs that had wandered onto his porch. "Well, look who decided to crawl out of the woods," Lawrence announced, his voice booming so his guests could hear every word. "I thought you had finally died in that cabin, Victor. I was waiting for the obituary so I could send flowers, or maybe a wreath made of weeds." The guest chuckled, a low, polite sound that made my skin crawl. Lawrence took a sip of his wine, his eyes scanning my faded fishing vest and the mud on my boots. "You know, the service entrance is around back where the trash is collected. That seems more your speed." I stepped out of the truck and the sound of my heavy boots hitting the pavement echoed. I didn't look at the guests. I looked straight at Lawrence. "I'm here for my grandson's things, Lawrence, and I'm here to remind you that throwing a child onto the street is a crime in this state." Nathan got out from the other side. He looked small standing next to the truck, but he straightened his spine. "Lawrence, we need to talk about custody," Nathan said, his voice shaking slightly but gaining strength. "You can't just lock me out. We have joint assets. We have a life." Lawrence laughed, a bark of a sound that lacked any real humor. "Assets? You have nothing, Nathan. You lived in a house I paid the down payment for. You drove a car leased in my company name. You were a pet we kept around because Michelle thought you were cute. But pets get old, and when they get old and useless, we put them outside." Then he reached into the inner pocket of his Italian suit. He pulled out a thick stack of bills wrapped in a blue bank band. He didn't hand it to Nathan. He tossed it into the air. The $100 bills fluttered down, like dead leaves, landing in the oil stain leaking from my truck and scattering across the dirty pavement near Nathan's feet. "There's your severance package," Lawrence sneered. $2,000. That should buy you a nice tent and maybe a few weeks of that cheap beer your father drinks. Take it and disappear. Consider it a termination fee for the marriage." Nathan stared at the money on the ground. His face was burning red, the humiliation radiating off him in waves. He looked up toward the house, searching. I followed his gaze. On the second-floor balcony, standing behind the railing, was Michelle. She was wearing a silk dress, holding a glass of champagne. She saw Nathan looking at her. She saw the money in the dirt. For a second, I thought she might say something. I thought she might show a shred of the humanity Nathan claimed she possessed. Instead, she turned her back and walked into the house, closing the glass door behind her. Nathan made a sound like a wounded animal and moved to step forward, but I put a hand on his chest. "Stop," I said quietly. "Don't give him the satisfaction." Lawrence and his guests were laughing now, openly pointing at the money. "Look at them," the councilman whispered loud enough for us to hear. "Probably the most cash they've seen in a decade." I bent down. The laughter grew louder. Lawrence grinned, looking down his nose at me. "That's right, Victor. Bow down. Pick it up. It's probably more than your pension pays in a year." I reached for a bill that had landed near my boot. I picked it up, but I didn't put it in my pocket. I held it up to the sunlight. The paper was crisp, too crisp. It felt stiff between my fingers. I spent 40 years in manufacturing and finance. I know the feel of money that's been in circulation, and I know the feel of money that's just come off a press, but this was specific. I brought it closer to my nose. It had a faint chemical smell, not the smell of sweat that covers most American currency. It smelled of ozone and fresh polymer. I looked at the serial number, L449200001. I bent down and picked up another bill, L449200002. Sequential serial numbers, uncirculated. And the blue strip was slightly off-center. This wasn't money from a withdrawal at a local Chase or Wells Fargo. This was Federal Reserve stock that usually went directly to international clearinghouses. This was offshore money, the kind you keep in a vault in the Caymans or Zurich and bring into the country in a private jet when your domestic accounts are frozen or monitored. A man who is downsizing his company because of budget cuts doesn't walk around with $2,000 in sequential offshore bills. A man who is broke uses credit. A man who is hiding assets uses cash. Lawrence Gibson wasn't just a cruel father-in-law. He was a man frantically trying to move liquidity before a crash. He was bleeding out, and this cash was his bandage. I pulled the rest of the stack from his hand before he could react. I slapped the entire stack against his chest hard enough to make him stumble back, spilling his wine onto his pristine shirt. "Keep it," I said, loud enough for the councilman and the developer to hear. "You're going to need it to buy sedatives, Lawrence, because when the auditors see what I just saw, you're going to have a very hard time sleeping." I turned around and walked back to the truck. Nathan was staring at me wide-eyed. I opened the door and climbed in. Lawrence was sputtering on the porch, wiping wine off his lap, shouting threats that we were trespassing. I put the truck in reverse and backed out, crushing the money he had thrown into the pavement with my muddy tires. As we drove away, Nathan looked at me. "Dad, what was that about? Why did you say that about auditors?" I kept my eyes on the road. "Because your father-in-law isn't just broke, Nathan. He's a criminal, and I just found the first loose thread in his sweater. Now we're going to pull it until the whole thing unravels." I reached for my phone. It was time to call Angela. I needed to know exactly which flight Lawrence Gibson had taken into the country last week and what was in his luggage. 3 days later, the morning sun was sharp and unforgiving as I steered my old truck toward the downtown district. Nathan sat in the passenger seat, wearing a new Italian suit we'd bought the day before. He looked out of place among the gleaming glass skyscrapers and the rush of suits heading to their high-rise offices. To him, we were driving into enemy territory, armed with nothing but a rusted vehicle and what he thought was an empty bank account. He didn't know that we were actually driving to the front lines of a war I had already won. I parked the truck 2 blocks away from First National Bank, deliberately choosing a spot where the meter was broken. Nathan looked at the bank's imposing marble facade and hesitated. "Dad, why are we coming to this branch? We should go to the credit union." I turned off the ignition. "We're here, Nathan, because this is where business is done. And today, we have business." The interior of the bank was cool and smelled of sanitized money and stale coffee. We walked toward the teller line, but my eyes were scanning the glass-walled offices to the right. And there he was, just as Angela had predicted. Lawrence Gibson was sitting in the main loan officer's cubicle. He didn't look like the arrogant king who had stood on his balcony. He looked like a man trying to hold back a landslide with a spoon. His tie was loosened slightly, and I could see sweat on his forehead despite the aggressive air conditioning. He was leaning forward, gesturing frantically at the loan officer. Lawrence was desperate. The bridge loan he was counting on from Trevor Barnes hadn't materialized because I had frozen Barnes's accounts. Now, Lawrence was trying to secure emergency liquidity using assets he no longer fully owned. At that moment, Lawrence turned his head. His eyes widened when he saw us. For a second, I saw pure panic, but then his brain reset. He saw my faded jeans and Nathan's work shirt. The arrogance came rushing back. He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back. "Well, I'll be damned," Lawrence's voice echoed off the marble walls. "If it isn't the gutter rats. What are you doing here, Victor? Did you come to cash a lottery ticket?" Nathan shrank back, but I stood my ground. "We're just conducting business, Lawrence, same as you. Although, from the looks of it, our business is going a lot smoother." That's when the branch manager, Mr. Thompson, stepped out. He was a tall man with silver hair who commanded respect. Lawrence immediately straightened his jacket, putting on his best charming smile. "Ah, Mr. Thompson," Lawrence said, stepping forward with his hand extended. "I'm so sorry for the disturbance. If you could just have security remove them, we can get back to discussing that line of credit." Mr. Thompson walked across the lobby. He walked straight toward Lawrence, who beamed, ready to be validated, and then Thompson walked right past him. He stopped directly in front of me. "Good morning, sir," Thompson said, his voice low and respectful. "I apologize for the noise." I nodded slightly. "No apology necessary, Roy." Nathan stared at me, trying to understand why the bank manager was treating a fisherman like royalty. Lawrence sputtered. "Roy, you know this man? He's a nobody. I insist you focus on my application." Thompson turned to Lawrence, the warmth vanishing from his eyes. "Mr. Gibson, I was coming out to deliver the decision on your loan application personally. Your application has been denied." "Denied?" Lawrence whispered. "That's impossible. I have assets." "Actually, you don't. We've received notice that your primary debt holder has sold your note. You're no longer dealing with the consortium. You have until noon Friday to settle the outstanding balance of $12 million. If the funds aren't wired by then, foreclosure proceedings will begin immediately." Lawrence staggered back. "Friday? That's insane. I need time to liquidate. You have 72 hours, Thompson said with finality. I suggest you spend less time shouting and more time finding a miracle. Thompson gave me one last nod before walking back to his office. Lawrence stood there alone, looking small. We walked past him toward the exit. As we passed, he didn't even look up. 2 days later, the Grand Hotel glowed against the city skyline. I watched from a black limousine as guests arrived for Lawrence's desperate charity auction. Women in expensive gowns, men in tuxedos, and there at the top of the stairs stood Lawrence in his element, playing the role of benevolent patriarch. Beside him stood Michelle and Trevor Barnes, posing for photos. We pulled up to the curb. I stepped out first, then Nathan. The exact moment Lawrence saw us, his face went from shock to rage. He practically ran down the stairs. "Security, get over here. I want these two removed." But the hotel manager stepped out, the same man from the bank. "Is there a problem, Mr. Gibson?" Lawrence pointed at us. "These imposters have crashed my gala." The manager looked at us and gave a subtle nod. "Mr. Gibson, these gentlemen are VIP guests. They represent Rodriguez Holdings, one of our most valued clients." Lawrence looked like he'd been slapped. "What? Who is Rodriguez Holdings?" I stepped forward. "I am Rodriguez Holdings, Lawrence, and this is my son, Nathan Rodriguez. We represent the capital that's going to save your auction tonight." Lawrence was trapped. If he kicked us out, he'd be rejecting the biggest potential donor. He had to let us in. Inside the ballroom, we found our table at the front. The auction began with smaller items, building to the finale. Lawrence took the stage for the final piece, a 19th century oil painting of the Gibson family patriarch. "This heirloom has been in my family for 4 generations, Lawrence announced. "The starting bid is $25,000. Trevor Barnes immediately raised his paddle, $25,000, then $50,000, then $100,000. This was the plan. Trevor would buy the painting for an inflated price, injecting cash into Lawrence's foundation. But Nathan simply raised our paddle, $250,000. The silence was absolute. Every head turned toward us. Trevor's smirk vanished. Lawrence looked furious. "Stop!" Lawrence screamed. "This is fraud. He has no money." The auctioneer asked for verification. Nathan stood, walked to the stage, and placed a black titanium card on the reader. The machine beeped. "Approved. The bid is verified. We have $250,000 from Mr. Rodriguez." Trevor tried to counter but couldn't access his frozen accounts. He was cut off. $250,000, Nathan repeated. "But I have a condition. Since Mr. Gibson personally escorted me out of his home, I want him to personally deliver this painting to me." The room went silent. Lawrence looked at the painting, then at the $250,000 on the screen. His pride was the only thing standing between him and financial ruin. I watched his internal struggle, saw the moment his pride broke. Slowly, Lawrence took the painting off the easel. He carried the heavy frame down the stairs, through the silent crowd, to our table. He held it out to Nathan. "Thank you, Lawrence," Nathan said, taking the frame. Then he handed it to a waiter without looking. "Put this in storage. I don't need it." That's when the FBI agents walked in. Lawrence saw them coming and froze. They walked straight to him, with handcuffs ready. "Lawrence Gibson, you're under arrest for money laundering and tax evasion." The room erupted. Michelle started crying. Trevor had already disappeared. Lawrence was led away in handcuffs. The man who called us unworthy, reduced to a criminal, being perp, walked past the cameras. We didn't stay for interviews. We walked out into the cool night air. "It's over, isn't it?" Nathan asked. "Not quite," I said. "But Lawrence won't be a problem anymore. And you, son, have a company to run." "A company? Gibson? Properties needs new management. I think Nathan Rodriguez, CEO, has a nice ring to it." We drove back toward the cabin, leaving the broken empire behind us. Nathan would wake up tomorrow as the head of a legitimate business. Bradley would have his father back, with his dignity restored. And I would go back to being just a fisherman, with a lake full of bass and a family that knows what real worth means. That's all the wealth I ever really wanted. Remember this the next time you see an old man in work clothes driving a beat-up truck. Never judge a book by its worn cover, because you never know who's really behind the wheel. And more importantly, never underestimate the lengths a father will go to protect his family. If you mess with the cub, You better be ready to face the lion.